communist gopher war has been waging for years. There's just so many of them. We're on the edge of defeat. There's no coming back. And we all felt like this was it. This was the end of humanity. But then, a new weapon was introduced. The ultimate gopher killing machine. And suddenly, the communist gopher army had no chance. This is not your daddy's 1022. It's a Desert Tech TREK-22 chassis that your existing Ruger 1022 goes right inside of. And this thing is actually really cool. Now, full disclosure before we get started, Desert Tech did send the TREK-22 chassis to me to check out and basically asked my opinion on it in the sense of whether or not it would be applicable to the preparedness community. And after hanging out with it for quite a bit of time and using it for quite a while now, I actually think it is very relevant. So I want to share all those things with you. I'm going to talk about some things I like about the chassis. I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I'm not really a big fan of, and then I'll give you all the details and everything else as well, because I think that this is a very viable option for making your 1022 a lot more mobile and a lot more packable. So if you're going to use it for a truck gun per se, which I think it's very good for in that sense, or if you're going to use it as like a bug out bag rifle, this is a great way to make things a little bit more compact without sacrificing any barrel length or any velocity or anything else from your 22 long rifle platform. So what does the chassis system do? Well, it shaves 10¼ inches off of the overall length without having to deal with any NFA stuff or anything like that. So that's really nice. This has an 18-inch barrel in it. Just so you can kind of see that and visualize it, 18-inch barrel. I mean, this thing is tiny. It's amazing how they were able to get this thing so compact. And that's why I really like it. That's actually the main selling point of this chassis. And it's designed with injection molded glass reinforced polymer, and it's a clamshell design, which means basically you're gonna take your 1022 receiver and barrel, and you're just gonna put it in between the two halves of the polymer chassis here, and then you're gonna bolt it together with a series of nuts and bolts. It's actually a really simple situation, and the installation does require time, but it's relatively user-friendly. So I just want to let you know I'm not going to show you how to install it, but I will go ahead and show you it all stripped apart so you can kind of see how that works and understand how the chassis interacts with your pre-existing 1022. And just wanted to give you some ideas about that, and then we'll talk about everything that I like about this setup and what I think is really good about it. I'll talk about a couple of things that I'm not a huge fan of, and then I'll just give you my overall point of view as to why I think this is actually a good idea for those of you who are using a 1022 as part of your survival plan. All right, so here's a close-up of my 1022 in the Desert Tech TREK-22 chassis. And what we're gonna do is just open this up and I'm gonna show you how the 1022 receiver fits into the chassis. That way you can get an idea of how the install and everything works, but it's very simple. The instructions are super basic. It's just 2 pages worth. And if I could do this, just about anyone else could do it too. So let's open it up and you'll see what it looks like once you have your receiver placed into the chassis. So this is what the chassis looks like when it's all taken apart. And obviously it's held together with a system of nuts and bolts. So the instructions tell you exactly where everything goes and how to install it, and it gives you torque value and everything as well. So I would suggest at least at the minimum having something like a wheel or fat wrench on hand in order to get everything installed properly at the right torque specs. Now over here you actually see the trigger pack inside of this side of the chassis, and obviously since it's a bullpup, the way it works is that you have the trigger that connects to this bar, and then this actually interacts with your factory trigger on your 1022. So you can just kind of see how it moves there, and it does the job like it's supposed to. Right here in the bottom is where that QD socket is, and you actually just sit that right there, and then when you install everything, it kind of just sits in there and gets clamped down by the clamshell design. And then there was an issue with my particular receiver on my 1022 being slightly out of spec. So this receiver screw actually comes in right here, as you can see, through the grip panel, and holds everything into place tightly in order to maintain, zero and everything else. And one of the issues I was having was my barrel was canted, and what we found was that the receiver was just slightly out of spec. So Desert Tech took it back, took care of me, made sure everything was working correctly, and we needed an extra washer right here, which is what this gold one is right here, in order to make sure that everything lined up properly. So if you're having any issues with your TREK-22 chassis and your barrel being like canted or anything like that, that's probably why. This is an old 1022, so the receiver was just slightly out of spec compared to what everything else was built for, but luckily Desert Tech took care of that no problem, and everything runs perfectly fine. Now, you might have noticed too that there is a little bit of tape here on the end of my receiver, and that's in order to keep my receiver pin inside, because honestly, if you've ever taken your 1022 apart before, you know these pins are super loose and just like fall right out. So I went ahead and just taped over that so it wouldn't be loose inside the chassis, because otherwise it was kind of like rattling inside of here. So I just wanted to show you what this looked like when it was all taken apart. Really easy install. You do want to take your time. You don't want to try to rush it, but make sure you have a way to ensure proper torque values. The instructions, like I said, are super easy to follow. And then I'm just going to throw this back together and we'll get back to it. All right, so I know a big question you have right now is how much does this thing cost? So it's kind of expensive, but that's just part of the game when it comes to designing something proprietary that does the job it's meant to do, right? So this chassis system has a $300 MSRP, and you can get it for about $285 street price, especially from companies like Midway USA, which... So when I was grabbing the price off of Midway's website, I noticed some negative reviews, and I wanted to check into that just to make sure to give you the best information possible. And according to those reviews, it seems that these chassis don't play well with aftermarket 1022 parts from Valkortsen or Timney. So this is really just for OEM Ruger 1022s. And obviously this isn't for building a precision rifle or anything along those lines. This is just to get a very compact 22 that's capable in order to have it with you if you're in your truck or bugging out or whatever. So I just wanted to mention that because I do want to make sure to give you the best information I can before you go out and purchase something expensive and then realize that it's not going to work for the 1022 setup that you have. Of course, they are the biggest supporter of the channel, so a big thanks to Midway USA for always helping me out. And that's actually where I got this Primary Arms SLX 1-6 ACSS Nova optic that I have on top of the Desert Tech TREK-22 you see right here. Now, real quick, just touching base on the optic. I like the LPVO for this setup just because it gives you a little bit of magnification, and of course with 22 long rifles, sometimes it's pretty much necessary depending on the size of game that you're using it for. But the other thing I like about it is that using a standard AR-15 style optic mount, you get the right amount of height to line your eye up with the optic correctly. You can't put a low mounted optic on this platform and use it. There won't be the proper cheek weld and eye relief and everything else that you would need. So you're gonna use either an AR-15 style mount to get the right height for your optic, or you're gonna use some extra high rings or something along those lines, but you cannot use low rings on this. And ask me how I know that. So don't make that mistake. You're gonna wanna use a standard height mount for an AR-15 or extra high rings or something that sits up a little bit higher, like your typical lower third co-witness red dots and stuff like that would work well as well. So just keep that in mind, but I really like this Primary Arms ACSS Nova. And one thing I'll say about that real quick is just to mention is that it is actually daylight bright when it comes to the illumination setting on this particular optic. So I'm really impressed with that aspect of it. Now, what do I like about this thing in general? Well, first off, it's lightweight. It shaves quite a bit of weight off the overall package, but that's all going to be dependent on your particular 1022, but it will accommodate bull barrels and things like that as well. So you're not just stuck with using like the standard carbine style 1022. You can actually use the bull barrel target models as well and stick it right into this chassis. So that's why the weight thing is just kind of dependent on your setup, but it does save weight overall, especially from like a wood stock. Now you have M-LOK rails, and you have them here at 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. So that's good to go, which I find to be very beneficial. And then you also have the Picatinny top rail, which if you're not using something like an LPVO, you could actually mount some other things on here if you wanted, like laser aiming modules or whatever else you want to do with your 1022, because whatever you got going on is definitely a little bit crazier than even what I do. But honestly, I think it's just great for mounting the optic, and it works perfectly for that. Now, the rail itself is actually on one side of the clamshell. It's not like a split down the center rail design or anything like that. It's on one side of the clamshell, so that way you're not sharing the rail in order to try to make that perfectly. So they did a good job with that to make sure that there wasn't any issues there or any rail flex or anything like that. So I do appreciate that. And then another thing is that the trigger is a bullpup trigger, don't get me wrong, you know, but it does shave a little bit of weight off the overall trigger pull, at least according to Desert Tech. It's kind of hard to tell just because it is a bullpup trigger, right? So it's spongier than the factory trigger, but I haven't had any issues with it. I can still jump rounds, no problem if I want to. I can still get accurate shots with it. So is it my favorite trigger? Well, of course not, because it's a bullpup, and basically you just have that trigger bar pushing into the factory trigger to set it off. So it's just extra steps, but in reality, it's not much of a hindrance either, and I'm able to still be accurate and get shots off, no problem. So no issue there. And then I guess like that might be almost like a negative just because the trigger is what it is. But the things I don't like about this setup right here, and just to give you some ideas about what I think is maybe something that could be improved upon. The main thing is that the sling swivel stud is right here in the bottom of the stock. And that's just not a good mounting point for a sling. It just never works out the way you want it to. It always makes the rifle just like turn or go the wrong way or whatever it is. I just don't like it. I'd either prefer it on top, which would be just better than on the bottom, or right here, which here's something I do like. You have storage for these 10-round magazines right here in the side of the stock, which is great, but I would rather have one magazine and a QD sling swivel attachment right here instead, or something like that, because this is actually where I want to be able to attach my sling, not on the bottom. I'd rather it be right here. I like having the additional magazines. I think that's definitely cool, and it makes it convenient for having additional ammo on the platform, which is definitely a positive, but I would have rather had my sling be able to be placed in a place that's a little bit more practical, I guess. So that is one of the negatives. And the only other real negative I have with the platform overall is just that the area of the grip here for your hand is a little small, which is fine probably for most people, but I just have pretty long fingers and pretty large hands. So it's a little tight, but it does keep a very svelte form factor because of that. So I can understand why they did that. But the other side of that, and I'll just show you this right here, is that the screws that hold everything together, right? The nuts and bolts, right? Well, they're all just a little bit too long. Now that can easily be taken care of with the use of like a Dremel or something like that if you want to get in there and do all that. But in reality, I just wish that the screws were a little bit more spec'd to the point where they aren't going to protrude out this side of the chassis. It's not really a big deal, but the one here on the hand grip itself is something you feel. It doesn't hurt or anything like that, it's just there. So it's something I would prefer not to be there, but it's also not something that I'm so concerned about that I'm gonna go out and start dremeling on it either. It's just something that I think that we could spec the screws on or the nuts on a little bit better in order to, or the bolts. I don't even know what I'm talking about at this point. Who knows anything about hardware? All I'm trying to say is that if this bolt was a little bit shorter, you wouldn't feel it, it would be good to go. So I wish all these bolts were a little bit more flush with the chassis rather than protruding slightly. Yes, it can be handled on your side in the sense of using a Dremel and stuff like that, but for a $300 chassis package, I would just hope that these bolts were a little bit more in spec to be flush with the chassis. So just my 2 cents. Maybe that's not possible. I'm not an engineer, but I'm just putting this stuff out there for you to be aware of before you go and acquire this, and for Desert Tech to be aware of, because they're actually pretty cool about making sure things get adjusted when it comes to like Gen 2 or whatever else it is. They take all the feedback they receive and they actually apply it to their next design set. So I'm just giving them my feedback here. And honestly, other than that, that's about the only negatives I have. So in reality, everything else is positive. I really like this setup. And once you throw in, like we got a 25 rounder in here, right? Let's go ahead and take one of these 10 rounders out of the side here, throw it in, and you can see that's with a 10 round magazine in it, it's flush. And this thing becomes very svelte, right? Like when I have this stashed in the side of my bug out bag, it's non-existent, even with the LPVO on here. And I just think that's super cool because of how compact it is. And in fact, if you were to show up with this, I don't know, at the range or on a hike or out at a campsite or whatever, I don't even know if people would assume it was a gun at first. I mean, it's like a really odd looking instrument that could just be about anything other than a gun. And yet it is in fact a 22 long rifle. So let me know if you have any questions about it in the comments below. I just think this is a cool product, and I appreciate Desert Tech sending the TREK-22 out to me. I think it's a cool product in general just for the prepper community, as we all have 1022s. We're all always considering how we would bring them with us, or how we would have them in our vehicle, or how we'd stash them in our bug out bag, or whatever it might be. And I just figured this chassis might actually accomplish that goal quite well, and it's something I wanted to share with everybody. Anything else you got from me, let me know in the comments below. If you need anything from me directly, you can go to magicprepper.com. And besides that, it's gonna be it for Magic Prepper.